Oh, all right. What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. And my guest today for a special interview episode, I had to work my ass off to get this guy on the show. He is a longtime scholar of Asian security, a career IR professor, although he had a life before the academy too that we might get into. He has written hundreds of articles. I shit you not. He was one of the pioneering voices analyzing Asian regionalism in the 90s. He's authored or co-authored or co-edited more books than I can count at this point. He's unbelievably prolific. I don't know anyone who has produced as much volume of writing on Asian security as this dude. And the quality of that quantity is also special. He is the first Australian IR scholar, or even like Australian period, that does the truth to power thing that this show is all about. You'll see for yourself in today's conversation, I think, that this is a dude who thinks for himself. That is part of his magnetic appeal. And that, more than anything, is I'm almost done. I'm almost done. And that, more than anything, is what I appreciate and what we need more of from public intellectuals. Now, this guy just retired last year from a career teaching all over the place, most recently at University of West Australia, where some shit went down, which we might also talk to him about. But the real driver for getting him on the show today is that he's got a new book out called Environmental Anarchy, Security in the 21st Century with Bristol University Press. I would not have bent over backwards to get him here if I didn't think the book was like mind-blowing, right? So I'm, of course, talking about the one and only Dr. Mark Beeson. How are you doing, man?
Good, much better for your big introduction, Van. I mean, just keep going. This is excellent. Just, very rarely get this kind of treatment, so I'm just good. I'm tempted to quit while I'm ahead, but we can do it for a bit longer. I think the audience, such as it might be, probably be a bit sort of gobsmacked when they actually hear me speak. But anyway, there you go. But thanks very much.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm gonna, butter you up briefly, as I just did, maybe, and then ask a few probing questions about the book, and we'll just kind of have a free flowing, jazzy conversation. So I've never read a book like this. The closest thing I can compare it to is Hedley Bull's Anarchical Society, which is like a pretty bold comparison, but I actually feel like there's a way in which it's very warranted. Like, nobody writes like this in academia. There's this, you have like a conversational, kind of cheeky, intimate tone, which is really refreshing as a way of like engaging IR and, security questions. So like, what, I'm reluctant to summarize the argument of the book myself because this thing has layers. So like, what do you tell people the core argument of the book is? And do you hold that to be something different from like the driving purpose of the book, or maybe your motivation of the book?
Okay, well, thanks again. I've never been compared to Hedley Bull before or mentioned in the same sentence. So I'm going to go cosmic on this one. I tell you, just keep up those kind of parallels and connections.
No problem.
But yeah, I don't know. The key argument of the book is an excellent question. I'll tell you why I started writing this book. I mean, I've been interested in the environment for decades now, and as we all should be, of course. And I've become more and more despairing of our chances of doing much about it in the time available. And I don't claim to be an expert on the technicalities of how we fix climate change. I mean, I've got a broad brush understanding, as we all do, I think, because we've been bombarded with it for years now, and we've got a vague idea what's going on. There is a problem. There are things we can do, but we're not doing them. I think kind of captures the essence of it. So that's my starting point, the same as it is for many, many other people, I suspect. My kind of day job, as you've just been telling everybody, is a kind of international relations professor. I don't claim to be an authority on international relations theory either, and I find Some of the theoretical discussions, bit depressing, bit unfathomable, not terribly inspiring. But I mean, I'm not denigrating my colleagues. I'm just, my contribution equally falls into that kind of category as well, in my view. But
Sure.
what I was trying to do in this book was just trying to clarify a bit of my own thinking about some of these kinds of issues and kind of lay out why it is I think that both us as theorists and commentators and analysts haven't been that fantastic, and certainly haven't influenced the practice of international relations in any significant way to the better, with the exception, and this is one of the things that I develop in the book, of realism. And I won't launch into a little diatribe about realism, but whatever you think about it, it has been influential in a way that other theoretical paradigms haven't generally been. And even those, that remark by Keynes about people laboring under the influence of thinkers even when they don't know it, I think that's true in international relations as well. And the
Hmm.
few people who, practitioners who know much about international relations, if you ask them to describe themselves in kind of theoretical terms, invariably, they've done surveys in Australia where kind of 80 or 90% of the people who work for the foreign affairs bureaucracy in Australia describe themselves as realists. What they mean by that is another question, of course, but it's kind of interesting that that's the label that they apply to themselves. And so, at one level, I think it's not controversial to suggest that realism has had a big influence on the way that we think about the world, or the policymakers think about the world, and the actions that they take. And that hasn't led to a happy state of affairs, because we find ourselves where we are today, facing a sort of an environmental apocalypse in the fairly near future, which we've just managed to add a fairly old-fashioned interstate war type crisis, which Mr. Putin says might go nuclear. So these are kind of interesting and slightly troubling times, and trying to think about what's going on and why we found ourselves in this situation, and what, if anything, we can do about it, or what, if anything, international relations theory may or may not tell us about it. It's kind of an interesting thing to do. So it was partly therapeutic for me, basically, writing the book. And I felt for about 10 minutes afterwards slightly better than I did before when I started it. So it wasn't all bad.
The book has a really strongly pessimist note, and you suggest that just now, but it's pessimistic in a way that, like, I don't know how many people listening, are familiar with Kurt Vonnegut, but like, he has this sort of rueful pessimism in the way he writes fiction, and it's a pessimism that makes you feel good, if that makes sense, or feel like maybe I'm not crazy after all. That was
Yeah.
kind of the vibe I got from your book. Is that the
Yeah,
Vonnegut of IR?
I'm a fan of good, and I can identify with that. And one of the phrases that I often invoke is "ho hum," which I think was a Vonnegut sort of expression that he uses, and it kind of just captures that. What can you do?
Yeah.
It's the sort of thing about whether you laugh or cry about some of these things. And so, I'm kind of mildly hysterical in my old age, so I tend to laugh more than I cry about these sort of things. But I don't know which of them is the more useful or appropriate kind of reaction. I mean, I would like to think that it was possible for somebody like me to make a meaningful contribution to these kinds of debates, but I don't flatter myself by thinking that it's at all likely. And despite the fact that I've spent, decades thinking about this stuff, and I don't have, well, I do have some ideas about what might be done, but I don't have any expectation whatsoever that they ever will be. And that's a kind of weird place to find yourself in as well. And it's true for a lot of other people who are much smarter and better informed than I am about the technical solutions, which I think there possibly are some possible things we could do that are more likely than others to make an effective difference. But the kind of people who hold those views, have those ideas, understand the technical complexities, aren't in positions of power generally to have the slightest influence over policymakers. They certainly aren't in countries like mine, and I suspect yours as well. So that's a bit of a problem, and a kind of what you do with that, whether you just sort of ignore it and hope it'll go away, or just get on with your life and have a good time, or quite what you do. It's an interesting and open question, I think.
Yeah. So throughout this conversation, there may be a couple times where I like pull quote from your book because it had a lot of good one-liners or like pithy statements that like really capture a lot in a short amount of space. And so like one of them is in the opening pages, you say, quote, there can be no real security that is not based on policies that transcend national borders. This claim is fundamentally at odds with the most basic assumption that shape strategic thinking around the world. The first responsibility of policymakers is to secure the safety of the nation. So, end quote. Could you elaborate a little bit on like what you are trying to say there?
Yeah, I mean, I still think that's pretty right because there is a disjuncture between what national policymakers think they're supposed to be doing and concerned about, and their first priority is, if you ask them, the safety of the nation. We've got to get that right. But what they usually mean by that is things that we can do as national policymakers, even when that includes allying ourselves to great and powerful friends, as we do in Australia and have
Mm.
done historically since the year dot. So that might be part of the way that we think about it because we're not that powerful in conventional terms and have to rely on other people, apparently, for part of our security. So that might be the way that we see it in a smaller country like Australia, politically smaller, that is. So that's kind of one way of thinking about it. But the bottom line, I think, is that policymakers everywhere, whether you're Xi Jinping or Joe Biden or Mr. Putin, what they think they're up to. I mean, it's always something that comes from a national frame of reference and the particular circumstances in which those policymakers have grown up, operate, think, the kind of mission they think they're involved in pursuing. And I think the challenge is understandable as all that may be, and and justifiable perhaps even as it may have been in the context of the evolution of human history up until fairly recently. I think the overwhelming uh, thing about environmental problems and climate change is that they are simply not addressable by individual countries acting alone. I think that's the
Yeah.
incontrovertible bottom line, which seems to be pretty hard for some of these people to get their heads around. But it's true, and everything they thought and knew about securing the nation doesn't really stack up in an environment where, a natural environment where we are interconnected. What we do affects everybody else. All the kind of usual standard things that we all kind of know backwards by now, and have heard people blather on about for ages. And yet, the interesting and paradoxical thing is, we don't seem to be able to apply that basic underlying insight into the nature of our collective fate and problems to public policy and international relations. And if we can't do that, seems to me, we're doomed. I mean, it's as simple as that. I just don't think that's why I don't know if you read that thing I sent you about, this little article I wrote by request, The Last Slap, because I lay out
Mm.
there a kind of, it's not quite the 10 Commandments, but the 10 suggestions about what you might do about fixing up the world. And, some of them, a lot of people would think are completely bonkers and unlikely, and indeed they are. But even the more kind of sensible ones are just absolutely unlikely to be implemented. It seems to me because the intervening variables are so influential and enormous and difficult to get over. Particularly this idea of the importance of sovereign states and autonomy and putting the national interest before everything else. I mean, all of that kind of stuff just gets in the way and stops us from behaving in the way that I think we would need to do if we're going to do anything really serious about climate change. And even though there's quite a few people around who would like to do something serious about climate change, I just think, given the kind of political structures and institutions and ways of thinking about the nation, the way that it operates, the way that it interlinks with other countries around the world, it's just not going to happen because it's just too difficult. It's just impossible to imagine Xi Jinping, Putin, Joe Biden, whoever, sitting around a table and really saying, okay, well, we'll do something really serious about this, even though we realize it means it's going to be a bit of a sacrifice on our part and we'll have to give up this and do that, help somebody else we don't even know. It's just not going to happen, I don't think. So that's my cheery, optimistic start for the discussion.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that is both appealing and frustrating is how correct of a diagnosis that seems. Like, and it's particularly bitter or ironic because, like, if you have a cosmopolitan outlook, surely you should be able to mobilize collective action. Surely you should be able to foreground transnational threats or things like climate change that affect all of us, right?
Mm.
And you don't see that at all. And then, but even if you're trying to, even if you, like, realism doesn't offer much of a toolkit for these kinds of problems, but even if you try to center the state as like the thing to be protected, or like it's all national projects of statecraft,
Mm.
that doesn't mean you get to ignore transnational problems. It just means that you have to figure out how to address transnational problems so that you can protect the nation. But what you have is like a mismatch or a refusal to like deal with reality, and that's the frustration, I guess. I don't know.
I tell you, one someone I'm a big fan of is Anatole Levin. I think that's how you pronounce his surname, and
Mm,
he's written an excellent book on a kind of realist take of environmental issues, and it's really good. And one of the points that he makes is that if you really are a kind of realist, then you should recognize that climate change is, well, until pretty recently, last week or so, seemed to be a much more immediate and important problem and threat to security, however you want to define it,
mm,
than interstate war was. And he makes the point that China and the United States, their biggest enemy or threat isn't each other; it's climate change, and it will come and affect us. In the pretty near future, and it will transform the way we think about the world. It will transform political activity and security practices as well, no doubt. But my fear is, and expectation, is that it'll transform it in ways that we don't particularly want to do. It'll be a scramble for survival in a rapidly sort of diminishing set of environmental circumstances that are increasingly challenging. And some of the old kind of strategic hardheads will come to the fore and say, oh, what we really need to do to respond to increasing levels of environmental refugees and migration and those kinds of, got to buy some more guns and bombs because we'll have to stop them on the beaches, clearly, and we don't want them coming over here and wrecking what's left of our life, and that might work for 10 or 20 years or so. It might be pretty awful and bloody and not very nice for the people who are on the receiving end of all of that. But for those privileged states that still have effective and functioning states, that might be a feasible kind of set of strategies for a few years. But it's a pretty short-term recipe. It's pretty appalling. It's not good for our collective self-esteem, to say the least, or for the sustainable management of the planet. And I think one of the paradoxes is that states, I'm quite a fan of state power, in inverted commas, and that needs a bit of unpacking, obviously, but having an effective state that can actually do stuff is better than having no state at all, or a completely ineffective, failing state, or a hopelessly corrupt state. And,
mm.
none of these things are actually mutually exclusive, as it turns out. But you get my point that having an effective state is potentially a good thing, but they are overwhelmingly still directed to doing things for the fortunate few who happen to live in those kind of geographically arbitrary boundaries and benefit from an effective and a functioning state at times. So the challenge, I think, is to recognize that state security and ultimately the security of the people who live within those boundaries is at one level arbitrary, but it's no longer going to be sustainable even for the fortunate few into the indefinite future, because as the rest of the world stuffs up, it'll eventually affect the more privileged, the North, or whatever fashionable trope we use these days to describe those of us who live in this kind of privileged enclaves. And it's kind of interesting to think about how much where you live shapes your view of the world, and that's kind of one of the things that I'm interested in as well. And clearly, the time when I was born, grew up, thought about these things, and my particular historical background has helped to influence my thinking about these things. But the fact that I live in Perth, Western Australia, which is arguably the safest place in the world, it turns out. So if any country or people ought to be conscious of their unbelievable good fortune to happen to live here, even though it's a little bit on the dull side, some people would say, but to recognize how fortunate we are to live in these circumstances, and the fact that most of the world doesn't live in anything vaguely resembling that level of certainty, security, and even environmental, reasonable standards. Still, despite the fact it's getting a bit hot here, we are unbelievably fortunate. So that kind of thing, your historical narrative, your kind of geographical circumstances, that can shape profoundly the kind of way you think about the world and what you think could and should be done. And in countries like Australia, it doesn't reflect that well on us, certainly at the policy making level, because it's just unbelievably self-absorbed, self-centered, short-sighted, and pretty hopeless, basically, in terms of where we're going to be in 10, 20 years' time.
Well, that's depressing.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking a lot about the concept of precarity. It's kind of like the word of our age, it seems like, and how it creates conditions from which we get shit like wars or anthropogenic disasters. And you don't actually use the word precarity in the book, but
Mm.
it's thematically there when you talk about insecurity. And at one point you say, I got another quote here. Where is it? Quote, one of the reasons why there is currently such a widespread loss of confidence in policymakers and their capacity to actually deliver on some of the most basic parts of their notional job descriptions is because few of us actually feel secure anymore. End quote. So, how do you think about precarity or insecurity as a problem? It doesn't really seem to feature in geopolitics or in analysis of geopolitics most of the time, but it's really omnipresent in the book, no?
Yes, I don't use that word. Nothing against it. I think it's quite useful, but it, for me, I mean, maybe it reveals the depth of my ignorance about quite what the people who dreamt up this word actually had in mind. I've always associated it more with a kind of national frame of reference and dealing with things like income distribution within national boundaries and that kind of thing. And the fact that some people haven't benefited from success stories like the United States, Australia, countries that are fabulously wealthy by global standards, but the big problem has been distribution of wealth. And the fact that in America in particular, less so here, thankfully, but it's still bad in Australia, there are quite indefensible disparities in wealth distribution, life chances, all of those kinds of things. And they are things that could be, I think, much more effectively addressed than they are at the moment. But that's a separate set of issues, I think. They're kind of public policy issues in a way. And I'm kind of more interested, given that I'm allegedly an IR person, I'm kind of more interested in the way that those kinds of things, inequality, in particular economic inequality, play out at the kind of international level. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and I'm absolutely no confidence this is going to be addressed either, but one of the biggest challenges, I think, is the sort of grotesque levels of inequality between the North and South, the First World, Third World, whatever we call them these days, the rich and poor, basically, those with chances and those without chances. And life is unbelievably grim still in large parts of the world. The great paradox is, I think we have figured out, this is us collectively, the human race, we have figured out some things we can do to improve economic development, life chances for different people. The rise of China is one of the biggest and most important developments in the whole of human history, bar none, or the re-emergence of China at the center of international affairs. And the fact that they've been able to lift millions and millions of people out of poverty is a remarkable and wonderful thing in many ways, I think, and somewhat unexpected, but it's a great triumph of human ingenuity, planning, understanding, and an effective state, of course. However, they've stuffed up the environment in the process, and they've got formidable environmental problems domestically, and it's such a huge economy and on such an epic scale that it's stuffing up everybody else's environment as well. And China's the kind of classic example of how it's impossible to insulate or uh, keep at bay the problems that other people create by their process of development and things. And the problem, of course, is so we've got this wonderful kind of success story, albeit a very, very qualified one in China. But other people are looking to China and the Chinese development model and style and blah, blah, blah as possibly a model for them. It's not going to happen. I mean, even if they had the same kind of state capacity that China has and all the things that go with it, good and bad, the chances of being able to replicate that particular style of economic development at this particular moment in history, I'd say are close to zero, personally, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa and other places where they're already involved in a pretty grim struggle for survival, even before Mr. Putin decided to blow up the world's granary in Ukraine and in parts of Russia. So we're going to have a famine on our hands in the next 6 months, year, 2 years, whatever it might be as well, just to add to all the other 15 apocalypse, horsemen of the apocalypse, or how many we're up to at the moment. So that's something to look forward to as well. But it just shows how national interests being pursued without any regard for the consequences on the rest of the international system can stuff things up in unexpected and breathtaking ways. And that basic structural problem about precarity or unevenness or inequality, or however you want to describe it, that's going to become worse, not better, as a consequence of recent events. It's going to be difficult to solve at the best of times. If we're involved in World War III at the same time, I don't think it's going to be top of the agenda, as they say.
Yeah, it's just it's like the international security environment is becoming more fragile. The stakes are, of course, very high, but the distribution of insecurity is very unequal. Or like people feel the immediate effects of problems differently. But that doesn't mean that there's no connection. And so you get things like the grain shortage, and that ends like in Perth, the safest place on earth, or in Wellington, where I'm at right now. We're still going to get consequences from things that are happening now. And one of the things that concerns me is like we don't do a good job as scholars theorizing the connections between domestic and global inequalities in various forms, and then more dangerous security environment. And then it's like, it feels like the former is feeding the latter. And so we're going into this era, or maybe we're already in it, of like heightened danger that's just unlike what we have come out of the past 40 years. And it owes to our willingness to perpetuate and like exacerbate these like extreme inequalities that like I would sort of fold under into like precarity broadly, but like call it whatever you want. It's like insecurity of one form ends up perpetuating insecurities in other forms that are more ultimately militarized. That's a worry I have.
No, I think that's right. But it's kind of challenging, I think, for people to think creatively about how they deal with problems outside of their borders. I mean, some countries like the US has taken this on as a sort of part of its sort of God-given sort of responsibility to the rest of the world to provide leadership and I think, to be fair, I'm quite interested professionally in the period after the Second World War, when some good things happened. I mean, there was the Cold War, which was a bit unfortunate, but it didn't come to blows, thankfully, or not between the major protagonists, at least. But out of that, the Bretton Woods institutions were created. There was the European Union. I mean, don't ask me leading questions about the European Union, because I can wax lyrical about that for hours on end, given the opportunity. But I do think that it's been one of the most important and optimism-inducing developments in the whole of human history, personally. And I tell students that, the European Union is the greatest invention of human beings, bar none. And they look at me aghast and think, what has this boy been smoking? But that's another story altogether, clearly. But it's true that we have made, collectively, in parts of the world at least, some progress in putting our national fates on a collective basis, even if it's only in one part of Western Europe, for
Mm-hmm.
may turn out to be a limited period of time. That's a remarkable and encouraging and optimism-inducing success story. The question has always been, is it possible to replicate that more broadly? And clearly, the expansion of NATO and the European Union moving eastwards and that kind of stuff has brought about more problems than perhaps we might have expected. And
Yeah.
the difficulty of expanding anything like that to Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, it's just unlikely. But hope springs eternal. But I think that's the kind of thing that makes me somewhat skeptical about our chances, because it was difficult even when the European Union was at the height of its powers
Yeah.
to maintain that kind of thing. But now that we're in a different kind of situation and there are things that are undermining the European Union, and the kind of depressing thing about the Ukraine thing is not only that it's a challenge to all of that institutionalized cooperation, but it's actually, people are celebrating the fact that Europe's coming together again and NATO's been revived and blah. But it's taken an interstate war in the heart of Europe to bring that about. So if that
Yeah.
takes to motivate policymakers to sort of get themselves a bit organized and think about the collective good, then clearly, if you extrapolate from there to climate change, which is the proverbial slow burner by comparison, then the chances of them getting equally galvanized by that in the time available, I'd say, are next to zero, because it's the scale of change and reform and collective action that would be needed to address some of these problems is quite literally unprecedented on a historical scale. And I just don't think, it's one interesting question to ask is, would any policymaker at any time in history, Roosevelt, FDR, Bismarck, I don't know who your favorites are, Napoleon, would any of them been up to speed or able to think in the kind of terms necessary about the collective interest and the challenges of fixing something as unprecedented as climate change or any of the other complex international problems that we currently face? And my guess is probably not, because it's pretty difficult
Yeah.
and the solutions are not obvious, and we don't have any precedents or examples, with the limited exception of the European Union, to encourage us. And the United Nations is a kind of great idea, but as we all know, it's got all kinds of formidable internal institutional problems and shortcomings, and that doesn't kind of look really up to the job either, given the kind of tools that are available to it, and the fact that boneheads from wherever can veto every useful possible policy innovation it can make. So that's probably a non-starter as well.
Yeah.
About this
On
question.
one hand,
You did ask.
what's yeah. No, it's a good question. Like, can the human mind or policymakers at all cope with the problem of what basically people are calling now hyper objects, things that are just so grand in scale and problematic that, like, where do you even begin, kind of thing. And I mean, separate from all that, I guess one of my concerns is in the NATO example that you mentioned kind of drives it home with Ukraine. The way that we have created zones of progress in the world,
Mm,
with, like, there are good news stories, the
mm,
way that we have generated them has been only by directing insecurity elsewhere. Like, it's been security for self at the expense of, like, deflecting or diverting insecurities to other places. And it creates what is at best like this zero sum or like perpetual whack-a-mole problem.
mm,
And that, you have a flavor of that in your book, and it's like one of those notes that rings like, oh, this is a cause for pessimism, and it's totally valid, unfortunately.
mm. But yeah, that whole thing about historical legacies, I think, is really important, and I think we probably all feel, that is the fortunate few of us who happen to live in places like Wellington, and I thought you were in the States actually, but when Wellington and Perth,
Everybody does.
put other little fortunate enclaves of stability and and progress in some ways as well, because things we can do here, and we've got multiple desalination plants because we're rich and affluent and we can afford to do that. We've stuffed up a bit of the environment, it's getting hot, but we can fix it still for a while at least, because we've got the resources, the ingenuity, the people, the money, so we can do all this stuff. So we're not at our wits' end yet, and it's not absolutely dire for us. So the challenge is, given our fortunate circumstances, to sort of think about people who aren't in quite such fortunate circumstances. And it kind of gets overlaid with all of this kind of stuff about, guilt about colonialism, imperialism. Are we
Mm.
responsible for the dire situation in Africa directly? And clearly, you and I are not directly responsible for the dire situation in Africa, because a lot of that imperialism and colonialism happened before we were even born. Even me, I wasn't around then. So we're not directly responsible for it. But at another level, we can make that kind of imaginative leap to recognize that we're kind of at one level all in this together. And it's just
Yeah.
sheer luck that some of us happen to have landed somewhere that can support us in the style to which we've rapidly become accustomed and enjoy. And, that's the other great paradox, that living in circumstances that are secure, relatively affluent, with options about, traveling around the world, doing interesting things, it's not a bad set of things to be attracted by and regard as being good. The challenge is, are they still as viable, good, and acceptable in some normative kind of way as they once were, when we
Mm.
know, because we see it every night on the news, that elsewhere in the world people are, plagued by famine, insecurity, failed states, getting blown up by the Russians. Lots of other things are going on around the world. And the question is, what do you do with that? I mean, I have intelligent, sensible friends who've given up watching the news. I mean, that's one response
Yeah.
to what's going on in the rest of the world. You just kind of void out and think, well, let's enjoy it while we can. And read that little thing I wrote. That's exactly the attitude, I'm ashamed to say, that I'm about to adopt myself when I go off on my little tour of Australia. So, but what do you do? I mean, I've written a book about it. I've made a few suggestions. I mean, what else am I supposed to do? I mean, or anybody else for that matter, without wanting to personalize my personal existential dilemma too much. But it's a challenge that faces us all. And
Yeah.
doing something with that, I mean, Greta Thunberg may be the sort of great role model for our times, in the sense that she's really put herself out there, tried to do something, and has, to her enormous credit, had an effect. But maybe that's another thing about this thing about where you are in the life cycle too, because Greta's slightly younger than me, and by the time she's my age, it's going to be 2070 or something ludicrous I worked out the other day. And
Yeah.
so, if we haven't done something pretty serious about the state of the world, then future doesn't look great. Whereas for me, I'm going to be around for, I don't know, 5 years or something like that. So, I mean, it's just the sort of the imperatives are just simply not as great for somebody of my age as they are for somebody like Greta Thunberg, which is why we should get, I think, more youngsters involved in the policy making process, because they got a much bigger stake in the future than the likes of I and Joe Biden have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. Um, So I'm on the left politically, but I'm not a Marxist, and it's kind of a running joke on this show that I say things that kind of sound Marxian, but then I kind of ritualistically affirm that I'm in fact not a Marxist, and so it's like hashtag not a Marxist. Um, with with this book, I bring it up because in the book you kind of have broken what has become a taboo in IR theory. So like people, the younger generation is not going to know this, but like in IR theory, all the way up to like maybe the mid '90s, it was completely normal to sort of pit IR theories against each other or
Mm.
talk about them as a basket. And those IR theories in the basket were realism, everyone knows, liberalism, everyone knows, and then the third one was fucking Marxism. And at some point, I don't know what the fuck happened, but like Marxism dropped out as the third paradigm and it got subsumed within critical IR. And then critical IR got like displaced by constructivism, the Alexander Wentz stuff. And so now, by the time I went to grad school, there was no Marxism, anything in the curriculum for IR theory. It was just realism, liberalism, constructivism.
Mm.
And you have like brought back, like you engaged in this book a little bit with Marxist literature to extract insights about like capitalism, imperialism, environmentalism. So I'm curious, like, A, what made you turn toward Marxist theory at all? And then B, like, what do you find there as an intellectual resource that is useful in this like Marxist tradition generally?
It's another of these kind of generational things in a way, even though I started late in my kind of academic career. I mean, I was telling you earlier on, I didn't go to uni at all until I was about 32. But
Oh
even,
yeah.
I started late, but Marxism was still being talked about as a sort of serious kind of uh, thing when I went to university. And I found it, I'm a sort of, I don't know what it means to be on the left anymore, but if there
Mm.
is something meaningful about it, that's where I am, I guess. And so I still, it still kind of resonates in some ways. But yeah, I mean, the one point about Marxism is the track record of application has not been encouraging. I mean, the
That's
Soviet Union wasn't the triumph. Mao's China wasn't the greatest example of this.
not so much.
But here's the thought about Mao's China, of course, or China generally. I mean, which is kind of it. What's always struck me that Mao tried to impose a kind of top-down kind of form of economic development in China
Mm.
with the leap forward and all this kind of stuff, which didn't end too well either. But it's interesting. Once Deng Xiaoping comes along and says to get rich is glorious and allows market forces to have a greater role in the Chinese economy, the place takes off big time. So that tells me, like rightly or wrongly, that left, once people get individual incentives to behave in particular ways and get the benefit of their efforts and all those kind of classic things that Adam Smith et al. Told us about, then that's good for economic growth. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. So, they don't like being socialized into having to share the fruits of their labor with other people who they think might be less deserving, not part of the family, don't know them very well, whatever it might be. And
Mm.
I was going to say microcosm, but you can't really say that about China. But in a national perspective, that's the kind of dilemma that we face more broadly, it seems to me, in trying to think about obligations beyond borders to other people we don't know
Mm.
and we think are undeserving and all those kinds of things. So that speaks to a kind of a wider set of challenges, I think. But my personal thing about Marxism, I mean, I went back to, as part of my academic career, to live in Britain for a few years, about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And that was interesting because there are still a couple of departments around Britain where there are serious collections of Marxist influenced scholars who work in a kind of tradition, particularly in political economy tradition, where those kinds of basic understandings of the way that economic processes work, the role of institutions, those kinds of things are still very influential and I think very useful. And one of the most influential books I ever read in IP was Robert Cox's Power, whatever it's called, the one, 1987, whatever it's called, Power, Order, and something else. But anyway, brilliant book, really influenced my thinking. When I read it, I thought, I might give up because I'm never going to do anything better than this. So unfortunately, that didn't stop me, so I carried on nevertheless. But
Yeah.
yeah, but I think that tradition of Marxist thought, particularly understanding political economy, is still interesting, illuminating. But as I say, the practice of Marxist ideas has not been great. But to answer your question about why I think that's kind of still useful, that basic Marxist thing about each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, whatever. I mean,
Needs.
it's a hackneyed cliche in many ways, but I think it captures something really important about the kind of historical moment that we find ourselves in. And, because I think if we are to do anything about our collective fate, then it's going to, whatever we do, it's going to end up looking more like socialism than it is like sort of unbridled capitalism, because capitalism is an unbelievably effective and dynamic set of economic processes that is just brilliant and generating kind of stuff of which I've got more than my fair share. So it's
Yeah.
absolutely brilliant at that, but it can, I think it's becoming painfully clear that we just can't go on like that forever, because there isn't enough stuff to go around or stuff to make it out of, or the consequences of producing all this stuff is stuffing up the environment. So I think all of that's becoming clear. So the question is, what's an alternative look like? And I think it looks like less of the sort of capitalist imperative and just churning out stuff ad nauseum, and more of the kind of, degrowthies, sharing available resources while they last in a more equitable and sustainable manner. And, I think that's all highly unlikely, I have to say, that that's going to happen. But I mean, if you
More
want to resort,
pessimism.
well, yeah, I think justified. I mean, can you imagine
Yeah, yeah.
Elon Musk or whatever his name is, and Bezos giving up all their loot and saying, yes, we realize the error of our ways. We are consuming far too much in these self-indulgent projects we keep embarking on, and
Yeah.
we're going to send some of this money over to Rwanda, because clearly there's a lot of good work needs to do in there. And to be fair, there's been a bit of effort by Bill Gates and his ex-missus, or was it Jeff Bezos, his ex-missus? One of them is doing good work and giving away lots of her loot, and so they should. I mean, the problem is, in my view, this is the ex-Marxist coming out in me, they should never have had this much money in the first place. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
the taxation system is for. If you're going to have a reasonably functioning, equitable, normatively sustainable society, you need an effective taxation system to do useful projects and to ensure that some few people don't get to consume far more of the world's resources than they actually deserve, and have the political power and influence that goes along with that. So it's not rocket science, but unless we do that, I don't think we've got much of a chance. And the chances of doing that, given the way that the political structure operates at the moment, again, I'd say next to zero.
Yeah. So you mentioned degrowth, and I wanted to talk about the climate crisis a little bit because, like, for the left, but also for just anybody who's like sane, the climate change is a climate crisis, and so the political imperative to do something is obviously there. People don't really disagree about that, but there is a disagreement about ways, or how to go about it. And within the left, at least, there's kind of like the center left neo-Keynesian view of like doing something like a global Green New Deal, like mobilizing large amounts of spending on behalf of green energy transition projects and this kind of thing. And the eco-socialists have like really rallied around the degrowth movement, which is to say, the global north basically has to stop pursuing economic growth, and that can still happen in the south, but we need to like redirect our commercial energies toward raising up the south, and then that's how we'll reduce emissions. What do you make of that landscape of ideas? Like, if those are the two broad, there's variations on like how to do this stuff, but if those are the two broad camps, what do you think is most feasible or desirable? It sounds like you don't think either of them is necessarily feasible.
Yeah, I don't know, but I should caveat first. I'm not an expert on this particular aspect of the debate. Some of the technicalities. There are some unbelievably smart people around with lots of
Yeah.
excellent ideas about what could be done in a fairly sort of orthodox developmental kind of paradigm and framework, by using renewable energy, by
Mm-hmm.
shutting down the coal industry, for example, which we should do in Australia, but it's not going to happen. But there are lots of smart people around with some excellent ideas who know far more about this than I do, and could speak to it much more credibly than I can. He should ask them, basically. But in terms of that broad debate, I mean, I think I'm probably more at the degrowth end of the spectrum, if it's likely to work, because the Green New Deal thing that's been touted in the States, my understanding of it is that it's largely focused on sort of American interests, and that's speaks partly to the way that even in democracies, and don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of democracy,
Sure.
and as Churchill famously said, I mean, about all the others. So it's got its merits, but the problem, and we're about to have an election in Australia, which will reveal this yet again, no doubt, is that everybody becomes obsessively focused on parochial interests. It's got to be good for Australia or good for the United States or whichever country you happen to be in at the time. And if it's not, it's kind of irresponsible and not really focusing on your kind of key job description. So there's obviously something wrong with them if they're thinking about that. But so that's one of the things to overcome. But if you went to an election in a democracy saying the thing we've got to do is to slow the economy down, to stop consuming more, and not only that, but we're going to increase taxation, and we're going to give some of that money that we from the increased taxation to people in the rest of the world that you don't know, don't care about normally. But because we recognise that it's in our collective interest to do so. So as an election platform, I'd say that's probably not the most attractive one that's going to get you over the line. It certainly isn't necessary, and I can't think of any other democracies around the world where it would. So that's the kind of basic political challenge that we're involved. So that's why I haven't got kind of obsessed about trying to figure out all of the kind of technical implications and strategies. So plenty of other people are working on that much more
Yeah.
informed way than I am. So, but I'm kind of interested in just getting to the place where we would actually take some of those ideas seriously in the first place. And we're kind of a long way from that, because even with some unbelievably smart people having some unbelievably good ideas about what we might do, there's a guy called Ross Garnaut in Australia who's written an excellent book called Superpower, which lays out in, I think, fairly plausible fashion how Australia could transform its domestic economy along sustainable lines and become a source of renewable energy for the rest of Asia. It's a pretty bloody good idea, and it seems reasonably plausible. It's got, as we say in Australia, Buckley's chance of being implemented, because the current government is in hock to the coal industry and wants to. We've dug up every last bloody ounce of coal from this country. We're not giving up on it because, some people are big donors to the Liberal Party, and on it goes, the usual kind of story. So it's kind of pretty universal around the world. And unless you can get over the initial political problem, then the rest of this stuff about the technical merits of this model or that model doesn't really matter that much. It's nice to have some plausible models to point to that you can say, well, if we just did this, things might be better. But you've got to get somebody to listen to it, and you've got to get somebody in power to take those kind of things seriously. And none of that's happening.
Yeah. Pessimism all the way down, man. So in chapter 4 of the book, you talk about grand strategy and how it's basically always been this space for like militarist projects or realist projects. And you note in particular how U.S. grand strategy has made a profound impact on the world, for better and for worse. But you also say that the world of American hegemony it's either cresting or it's over or it's on its way out. And so can you talk a little bit about what you see as bringing about U.S. relative decline, like what's making that happen?
Short answer, of course, is the rise of China and the rest. China's just such a big thing. It's the biggest thing in, well, maybe everybody's lifetime, but so maybe ever. But it's just a really big thing in the recent history. And because, we have to remember, for whatever it is, 60, 70 years, America did have a fairly hegemonic position. There was the Soviet Union, of course, and the Cold War and all the rest of it. But America did exert a huge influence over large parts of the world, either directly or indirectly, as a consequence of its institutionalized presence around the world. And that wasn't all bad, it has to be said, because as I mentioned, the European Union came out of American geopolitical ambitions after the Second World War, and that, in my view, was no bad thing. And so there was some, and it could have been worse. I mean, I'd sooner see American hegemony than Nazi Germany hegemony, for example. That might have been less attractive. So it's all kind of relative. But I think it's coming to an end now, because the rise of China is just such a formidable kind of thing, and there won't be that possibility for hegemonic dominance that once existed for the United States, I don't think. And I think the problems domestically for the United States, I mean, this is my view as an outsider, but it just looks like an absolute shit show from a distance in terms of the domestic politics, the domestic priorities, the inability to be able to do pretty basic stuff in America. I mean, America's the richest country in the world still, unless I'm lagging behind the times. But I mean, the basic infrastructure, roads, bridges falling down, healthcare systems, absolutely pitiful if you happen to be poor in America. I mean, as a sort of, indicator of good public policy. I mean, no wonder some people are looking to China with admiration and thinking, because at least most of the indicators are still pointing upwards in terms of development and those kinds of things. The long-term trajectory might be not too encouraging because it's probably likely to end in tears. But at the moment, and that's all policymakers seem to give a stuff about, basically, at the moment, the indicators in China are comparatively favorable. So even at the level of kind of role models and ideational influence and soft power, as Mr. Nye would say, China's looking surprisingly good. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is not a carte blanche endorsement of everything that China's done, because plainly, some of the things that China does domestically in Xinjiang and Tibet and other places are pretty awful.
Pretty
And
fucking bad, yeah.
some of the things it would like to do to Hong Kong and Taiwan are pretty awful as well. So
Yeah.
it's not an ideal role model for running the world either. But in terms of the way that we've been used to thinking about the world and the dominance of American ideas, power, influence, I think that is definitely coming to an end. What will replace it? Whether it's going to, be the Thucydides trap and it'll all end in guns and bombs and whatever. One would think that wouldn't be the case, that rational voices will be heard and the policymakers will recognize that risking World War III over something like that is probably not a good idea. But who knows? I mean, we'd have said exactly the same thing about Western Europe, or Eastern Europe, I should say, up until a few weeks ago, when Mr. Putin decided to invade. We would have thought that was a non-starter and completely bonkers and futile and pointless, all of which it is, of course, but he did it anyway.
It happens anyway.
Yeah.
If I mean, so the U.S. is in decline. A lot of that has to do with China or the conditions that we made that gave rise to China. But if the U.S. were to adopt, so there's conversations happening in the U.S. about altering the scope or the range or the type of American grand strategy. So a blueprint for operating in the world, like, a break or departure from how we've done it in the past. And so if the U.S. were to adopt a different mode of interacting with the world that was not so realist inflected, do you think that the United States has enough, I don't know, clout or whatever on the world stage to have that be transformative in a good way? Like, can U.S. grand strategy be an answer if it changes to your pessimism?
Maybe. I mean, hope springs eternal, and they are in a position to do things that countries like Australia and New Zealand, I dare want to say, can't do, because they're just, power counts for something. Material power is important. Having a big economy is important. Having lots of guns and bombs is important, because other people will take you seriously in ways that they might not otherwise. So all of those kind of traditional kind of measures of power and influence are probably still important, unfortunately. But I mean, I think the United States does have a capacity to have a kind of an informed, reflective debate domestically, and to think about. And there's some very smart people in the United States who have interesting ideas. Often they don't get much of a look in policy-making terms, but I think it's dawning on people in the States that they won't ever have that kind of, certainly they're not going to have a unipolar moment, but they might not have anything like the kind of hegemonic influence that they once had either. So recognizing that, people have talked about the kind of G2, America and China getting together, recognizing that neither of them can be entirely dominant. Both of them are going to have a much greater influence than many of the other countries around the world. And maybe they could do something useful with that. My suggestion, this is going to get nowhere either, but my suggestion would be the United States and China recognize the uniquely powerful position they're both in, recognize the importance of climate change, recognize the futility of spending endless amounts of money on new guns and bombs and super duper missiles, because, worst case scenario, we'll never get to use them. They're just a colossal waste of money. Best case, we get to use them, blow ourselves to the shit house. So either of those two trajectories are not exactly encouraging. So what they do instead is they recognize this and agree to immediately institute a major arms reduction agreement because of the futility of wasting all this money, and they use the money they save on reconstructing their own economies along sustainable environmental lines. And if they're feeling extremely altruistic and wanting to spread soft power and goodwill around the world, they dole out a bit of money to other places. And I've also suggested recently to bemused reception that China, if they wanted to demonstrate their bona fides as an effective world citizen, might, because they've got an oversupply of housing in China famously now, so they could send out armies of these house builders, send them to Syria, rebuild some of the places they've been, not the Chinese, but we've all been instrumental in blowing up for the last 10 or 20 years. There's plenty of good and useful work to be done around the world. The Chinese are very good at building infrastructure. Let's do something useful. We're going to be able to rebuild Ukraine pretty soon as well. So it's not going to be very good for CO2 emissions, but it's going to be very appreciated by the Ukrainians and the Syrians too. And but that's, if I can digress just briefly on that. I mean, that's kind of interesting as well, because we're all thrilled and excited that the Poles and the Latvians and whoever have been taking in refugees from Ukraine, but and good on them. That's absolutely fantastic, and it's triumph of the human spirit and all that.
Yeah.
However, it didn't have the same attitude towards the poor old Syrians, because we've been blowing them up for years and years, and nobody wanted to take them in, and in fact physically rebuff them when they turned up on their doorstep. So there's a bit of tribalism, racism, just the problems are formidable. And if you're at the bottom of the kind of food chain when it comes to international concern, then things are still pretty grim. And, if we're going to start rebuilding anywhere, I'd say start with Syria first, personally, because everybody had to go blowing at the poor old Syrians. Even the Australians bombed Syria. I don't know quite why. I still find that a bit unfathomable, but I think it was because we were doing our duty for the Americans, and they thought it probably was a good idea.
So I have a tangential question in all this about progressive politics and IR theory. So I'm sure you're aware of, in the U.S., the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, kind of like an anti-war think tank, but very sort of realist-oriented. And there's been this transpartisan coalition of realists like John Mearsheimer, like Steve Walt, who align with leftists on things like the Iraq War. And then back in the Cold War, you had the anti-imperial leftists and the Black Panthers and all of that. They were aligned with Mao and Kim Il-sung and like hardcore despots, actually. But there's this, what I'm getting at is like, there's this ongoing debate, especially right now in the American left, about the fact that we do not share the realists' ontology. Realism does not offer us like a positive agenda to live up to the promise of the Enlightenment or whatever. Realism would have us do things that violate our commitments as, political humans or whatever. And so like, where do you fall on this? Does realism as a project offer something to people who are progressively minded? Is it misguided? What's your take?
Well, I think people like Mearsheimer is a really bright guy. There's no doubt about that. And he has some clear arguments that he makes really, really well. My reservations about that is that he thinks that American liberal idealism and hegemony was misguided, ill-conceived, couldn't be realized successfully, and that they should concentrate on their own affairs and do what they can where they can in a kind of realist manner. Now, that mantra, do what you can where you can, I think is a very useful mantra to have in life. But I don't think realists tell us anything useful about what to kind of do with that underlying sentiment, because it's still it's overwhelmingly nationally focused. It's about and it's a grim and unrelentingly pessimistic view. I mean, you might think I'd sympathise with it given what I've been saying so far, but I think that's part of the problem. That their starting point is that the world is not fixable. All you can do is really do what you can within national borders and look after your own sort of sovereign interests. And there's something in that, and it's the evidence suggests that under certain circumstances, that kind of strategy might work very effectively. And if you weren't plagued by the prospect of imminent environmental apocalypse, maybe that kind of thinking might not be a bad starting point either, to have more modest goals, to fix up your own domestic circumstances first, spending a bit of money on the domestic infrastructure in the United States, for example, all that kind of stuff. That might not be a bad idea. It might be quite a plausible suggestion. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. And that's, I think the challenge is to make realism more realistic, to recognize that there are things affecting that kind of national domain that make national autonomy, sovereignty absolutely impossible to realize in any meaningful, long-term, sustainable manner, because the material circumstances simply will not exist to allow that to happen, because weather events are going to come across the Atlantic and get the Americans just as well as they're going to get everybody else. So that's the reality of things. And unless we make that part of a kind of realist understanding of the world, that our security is bound up with that of everybody else, whether we like it or not, whether we like the people we're bound up with or not, that unless we kind of get that in some really fundamental way, nothing's going to change, and we won't be able to address the really fundamental long-term problems that are still coming to get us. If and when we ever sort out the Ukraine and we stop blowing each other up and we start rebuilding, climate change is still going to be there. It's going to be a bit worse, in fact, because we've been distracted by trying to stop a major war that we didn't expect. And we're going to have to start rebuilding and using resources that we weren't expecting to. But that problem is going to be worse and unaddressed. And until we kind of get ourselves in a situation where that is the single most important priority for everybody on the planet, basically, until we do that, until we could do that, nothing's going to change in a significant way. And I think we're still going to be, looking down the barrel pretty soon.
Yeah. On chapter 5 of the book, you talk about neoliberalism, and you're pretty rightly harsh on it, or you take it to task in a way. And I think now it's pretty. We're beyond the phase of like thinking that neoliberal policy prescriptions around, austerity and privatization and deregulation, like those things still happen, but they're not the politically popular thing that maybe they were in like the 90s. And there's this huge, like, the left has been fighting neoliberalism forever, or since the 70s when it became a thing. But like, it matters a lot whether neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization is like the economic order now globally. Like, is it still hegemonic, or are we moving out of it? Like, we see all this emergency spending on behalf of the pandemic and stuff. Are we post neoliberal, or are we still neoliberal? If we're post neoliberal, what are we?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think neoliberalism was ever quite as big or is certainly not as universal a thing as a lot of people would have had us believe, because powerful states have always been around. Powerful states have always intervened if they chose to do so. And the pandemic recently has been a classic example of rediscovering the wonders of Keynesianism and pump priming and all the rest of it. And sort of massive state intervention and control and things, even in the liberal heartland. So I think it was all a bit overstated, even within some of the liberal countries. But I mean, given the fact that we now have big parts of the world that aren't neoliberal by any stretch of the imagination. Well, it depends what you think neoliberalism means, of course, I suppose. But I don't think now. I mean, China is not my idea of a neoliberal economy. It's that stuff that Ian Bremmer goes on about state capitalism and those kinds of things. It's a pretty useful way of describing what goes on in places like China, because it's a capitalist economy of some sort, but it's a highly controlled one. And Xi Jinping's, I think, on a bit of a mission to make it even more tightly controlled than it already is. So there has been, clearly the Chinese economy has changed quite a lot over the last 50 years or so, but it's certainly not my idea of a neoliberal economy. And I think the Chinese Communist Party is anything other than a hands-off kind of economic manager. I think
Yeah.
they really want to maintain tight control over lots of key elements of the Chinese economy and direct it to ends which they think, by their kind of national perspective, it should be directed towards. So I think it's always been a bit overstated, and but I think that the things that it highlights about inequality, precarity, those kinds of things, I think they're worth thinking about, taking seriously, and
Mm.
if for no other reason, neoliberalism's a kind of useful shorthand for just basic inequality of opportunity, economic circumstances, security, all of those kinds of basic indicators of what's going on within the national borders of particular countries. But at a international level, I think the thing about the World Bank and the IMF imposing neoliberal policies on the rest, I think that was always a bit overstated and a bit of a simplification. I mean, clearly, hegemonic influence was exerted through those powerful institutions over the last 50, 60 years, and that's obviously had an impact around the world. But I think it's a bit of a simplification just to say,
It's more complicated. Yeah.
yeah, I think everything about life is more than we're led to believe. I think
Yeah. I'm mindful of time because we've been going a while, but I just have a couple more questions. If we pivot from your book to your larger perspective on things, you've been doing Asian security, I mean, almost as long as it's been a research program. And I actually have a book coming out at the end of the year where I draw a lot on your older research about Asian regionalism and APEC. Um, and before I found out about this environmental anarchy book, it was really that, like getting into your old publications that made me really want to like reach out to you. Because you were one of the only people, and I don't know if you, I think you still believe this, but you're one of the only people at the time in the 90s who could see that the pageantry of Asian regionalism was really doing a lot of work on behalf of neoliberalism and kleptocracy, and labor and civil society across the world's largest region were basically getting fucked. And then we were calling it peace building and diplomacy. And it's not that those latter things were not happening, but they were doing like almost like APEC in particular was doing like reputation laundering for a neoliberal agenda.
Mm.
And I didn't see a lot of people who wrote about regionalism. They took a much more sanguine view at the time. So, I mean, I would really like to get you to just reflect on all of that. Like, can you talk about what it was like to do Asian security in the 90s and in the War on Terror days? Did you feel like you were pushing against the current in some ways? Like, just
Oh no, I
any thoughts?
wouldn't be as grand as that at all. I don't think I was even aware of what the currents were, to be perfectly honest. But I mean, my kind of background was I started off, if I was anything, I was a kind of international political economy person. I did my PhD somewhat belatedly on Australia-Japan relations, because Japan was a big deal in the
Mm.
80s around the world, and so that seemed like a pretty good idea. I thought I might get a scholarship out of it or something if I chose something suitable. So that worked out pretty well. So it was a bit instrumental, but it kind of got me interested in the Asian region. But initially, my primary interest was political economy, and that's why I got interested in things like APEC, which I have to say, I find APEC stupefyingly dull, and I can't imagine why it's still.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic illustration of the kind of institutional inertia. Once you set up one of these institutions, it doesn't matter how crap or ineffective or pointless it actually is, you can't get rid of it. So it's still
Yeah.
I don't know what it's done over the course of its lifetime, but even when it was set up, it was a kind of testimony to how a small number of an epistemic community in places like Australia and the United States, who are champions of free trade and liberalization. And there might be much to be said about those kinds of things. I mean, that's a separate kind of debate. But, whatever the merits of that agenda were, nobody in East Asia was terribly interested in taking it seriously. The only reason they all agreed to sign up was because they wanted to get continuing access to North American markets, which had been the driver of East Asian development over decades. So the whole thing was a bit, implausible. And as I say, I still can't work out what the point of APEC ever was. And I had a certain orientation towards some of these debates, which was initially primarily about political economy, and I got kind of interested in things like ASEAN for similar sorts of reasons because it was an example of institutionalized regionalization,
Mhm.
which I was interested in as well. But gradually, I'm a bit slow at times, but gradually, you couldn't really or understand anything about East Asian development more generally, unless you thought about the security environment, the kind of geopolitics of the region in which it was happening in. And that kind of got me interested in these kind of security questions and the kind of influence of American hegemony in the region, which has been profound and not always worked out quite the way it expected to, because whether Americans still think that inviting China to join the WTO, for example, or allowing it to, or how we describe
Yeah.
it, was a good idea in retrospect now that China's about to eclipse them as the biggest economy in the world. Seemed like a good idea, as they say. But that's, that kind of got me interested in some of those questions and about the influence of the security architecture in which many of these kinds of processes evolve. So I was a bit late to that kind of security party, I have to say. But that's become my principal focus of attention, I think, over the last few years, thinking about these security issues. Not because I think that there's something particularly useful to be learned in terms of policy agendas from some of that kind of stuff, because I find some of the debates about security in Asia even more depressing and baffling and ludicrous in some ways than
Yeah.
I do the economic ones. So, in my own country, Australia, is a classic example of just how ludicrous the kind of priorities and thinking can become as a consequence of buying into these kind of big narratives about geopolitics, the rise of China, what should be done. Because I don't know if you know, but Australia is about to buy some astoundingly expensive submarines that won't arrive for about 30 years, will be
Yeah.
to date and overtaken by cheap and cheerful technology by the time that they do, and won't protect us or deter China in the slightest. I mean, if China is not deterred by the military might of the United States, I mean, what notice is it going to take of Australia, whether we got 6 submarines or bloody 60 of them? Absolutely none. But in the meantime, we'll have wasted scarce resources that could have been devoted to doing something useful in this country and possibly even elsewhere, and we'll have been distracted from the more central challenge of actually trying to do something about the way this economy is organized in this country and putting it along more sustainable lines. So there's a shocking waste of scarce resources, an opportunity costs, as the economists would describe it, that goes on in this country and elsewhere as a consequence of the, I think, flawed thinking about initially economic policy, and more recently and even more alarmingly, because APEC's pretty harmless if nothing else, but some of
Yeah.
these other, like the Quad and these other kind of loopy Cold War style initiatives and organizations, I don't think they're a happy indicator of where we're headed either.
Yeah, one of the things that really bothers me, that I mean, so it's possible to make arguments about the need to invest in certain military things as part of an argument about deterrence. If you're making that argument well, the thing that one problem is that like these arguments are never made well. They're very thin, superficial references to the balance of power and deterrence and things, but it's really just like rhetorical legitimation strategies in order to spend money on shit,
Mm,
hardware. And
mm,
then like that's like the best case scenario basically. And the thing that bothers me is that the discourse around basically militarist policies in Australia more and more, it seems like, but for a long time in the US, is that opportunity cost. What is all the shit that you cannot do and cannot focus on, and that comes at the expense of your militarism, of your need to do
mm,
stupid shit like buy submarines? So like there is the danger quotient in that specific frame of like, what are we what what is the consequence of playing the balance of power game
yeah,
basically? But then like separate from that, it's like the energy and attention you're putting on balance of power politics, for lack of a better, that's being generous, but like if that's what you're doing, what is it that you can't do because of that? What is it that you're forsaking because of that, or deprioritizing because of that, you know? Are you
Mm.
making your national project this negative thing that's inherently high risk and nothing more than the negative thing? Do you not have a positive vision for your place in the world? Like, that's the part of the conversation that really fucking bothers me.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And I think one of the, I mean, I kind of, as you can gather, bang on about these kinds of things. But people talk about middle powers these days as
Mm.
another thing in the international system, and it's
Yeah.
a way to big countries like Australia and New Zealand, of course. And I think the good thing about this is that, I mean, there's a lot of theoretical things we could talk about, but the good thing about this is that countries like Australia and New Zealand do have an opportunity to do things differently because the balance of power in any sort of serious and meaningful sense doesn't depend on what New Zealand does. Certainly, it doesn't depend on what
Yeah.
Australia does, even though we're slightly bigger than New Zealand. And the encouraging thing about New Zealand, in my view, and I wrote a little thing about this, which was met with bemusement as well, of course, is that we should emulate New Zealand's attitude towards national security. Because if I understand this correctly, New Zealand's just basically kind of given up trying to defend itself and having an air force and an army.
Mostly, yeah.
Why wouldn't they? I mean, was there 3 million people or 4 million people in New Zealand? I mean,
Five, but yeah.
why would you want to spend limited resources on defending yourself from a problem or a threat that doesn't actually exist? I mean, who is about to step up and invade New Zealand, and what could they do about it realistically, even if they
Mhm.
did? So, middle powers do have the capacity to act differently. Australia, if it wanted to, could become, Switzerland of the South Pacific, for example. They could decide they're going to be neutral. They could decide they're just going to defend their own national borders from some invader. It'd probably be boat people or asylum seekers or whatever, not China, I suspect. But they could decide they're not going to bother with the subs, not going to bother with all this other crap they're about to buy, which is going to cost squillions that we don't actually have. So they could decide to do all of that, and it wouldn't make the slightest difference, I think, to Australia's overall strategic position in a kind of conventional security sense, and
Mhm.
because any less secure. Now, the counter argument that you get in Canberra, of course, we couldn't possibly take that chance because we're, dependent on the United States for intelligence and access to sophisticated military hardware, which costs an arm and a leg, of course. But we couldn't possibly put any of that at risk because we'd be vulnerable. And of course, China would immediately invade when they saw that America wasn't. Nobody actually said it. But that's the kind of assumption that we would be exposing ourselves to risk which any self-respecting national policymaker, which is where we started the discussion, any national policymaker could not possibly be so reckless as to jeopardize national security. And again, the thing is, they're looking at the wrong problem. Australia is just not going to be invaded, is not going to be directly threatened by any kind of conventional, old-fashioned, traditional sort of security threat of the Putinesque type. Luckily, we don't have borders with anybody, so just getting here is a bit of a big ask for any would-be invader or threatening power. So we do have the
Yeah.
opportunity to do something different. We do have the opportunity to make ourselves a good international citizen of the sort that people are always banging on about. We could spend much less on self-defense, much more on restructuring the economy, closing down the coal industry tomorrow, which would be a nice gesture to the rest of the world saying, we recognize that this is one of the biggest contributors to CO2 emissions, bar none, that is mining coal. We're going to stop it as our gesture to the rest of the world because this is the right thing to do. This is what being a good international citizen is all about. And it's going to cost us a bit. There'll be a few people unemployed, but luckily we're rich. We can give them new jobs. We can just pay them to sit on their asses by the beach for the rest of their lives and not be miners. And that wouldn't be a bad outcome all round, in my view. But the chances of any of the above happening are next to zero.
Oh my God. Well said. Well said. Uh, one last question, kind of quickly, and definitely orthogonal to all of this stuff we've been talking about. When it was last year that you retired, right, from University
Uh,
of West Australia?
December. I'm still doing a bit.
December.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm officially retired from UWA. Yep.
What is happening in? I feel like what's going on in Australia it mirrors in a lot of ways what's going on in the US, but maybe it's like a Western thing, period. Like what's happening in Australian higher education. And there was like this debacle at the university at the time that you retired. Like you took a vocal stand against the leadership because they were, I don't know, shit in the bed on managing the institution. Do you have anything you want to share about that, or
Sure.
like clarify what
I
happened?
mean, it won't make me any more popular than I am already. But yeah, it's interesting because the University of Western Australia, it's not a bad university. In the scheme of things in Australia, it's considered to be one of the quote great eight universities because they're a bit older and a bit more prestigious and a bit up themselves, to be perfectly honest. But that's another story. But anyway, they've decided that a number of the universities have decided, partly because of the disappearance of foreign students during the plague, that they've got financial problems. The University of Western Australia has decided it's got financial problems that are quote unquote structural in nature. Now, nobody quite knows what this means, and it's dreadfully non transparent and opaque, and they're very reluctant to share any of the vital information with anybody, especially the faculty and staff of the university. But I
Mm.
got one of my smart research students who knows much more about this than I do, is much better doing research than I am, it turns out. But she looked into the fiscal position of the university over the last few years. Apparently, they've been running a surplus for a number of years. So there's no real day-to-day problem in running this university. But like many other universities, it's decided that this is an opportunity to balance the books, get things straight. So the way they're doing this is by sacking the staff. So lots of members of faculty and the admin staff have been summarily sacked at short notice, and entire departments have been closed down. Anthropology no longer exists at
Oh
UWA.
wow.
Well, there might be one person left doing it, I think, as a sort of token gesture. Sociology has been closed down. And it's no coincidence, it seems to me, call me paranoid if you like, but our federal government in Canberra loathes and detests people like me for obvious reasons.
Can't
But they
imagine why.
people who work in social sciences and those kinds of things are self-indulgent wankers who produce nothing of any use and don't contribute to society in any meaningful way, and stop young people from rushing out and getting serious careers in STEM subjects, whatever they are, and doing useful things for the national interest. So they
Yeah.
think it's all a bit of a self-indulgent, lot of taxpayer funded nonsense, basic, and they would like to shut it down. And their way of trying to do this was to jack up fees for students doing social science subjects to, well, I don't know, 2 or 3 times what they were before. I should know the facts, but it's quite
Jesus.
a big increase in the
Yeah.
fees for doing these things. Interestingly, we still got more students than ever doing some of these subjects because students, to their credit, are interested in trying to figure out what's going on in the world. These days, they're going to have a hard job finding that out at UWA because they sack most of the staff who can tell them. So this could be. Well, I want this will sound a little bit too conspiratorial. I won't say that the government's doing this to stop them from figuring out what's going on with climate change, but it is interesting that one of the most influential and high-profile people in our geography department at UWA is a climate, an environmental expert, and on the politics of the environment. She got the chop as well, even though she's one of the most well-regarded and
Wow.
profile people working in this area. So you can be forgiven, I think, for feeling slightly paranoid about the underlying strategy of this. But basically, our new vice chancellor, newish, she's been there a couple of years, was hired, I think, with precisely this goal in mind to balance the books, get the university on some more sustainable long-term footing,
Mm.
financially at least. And so that was his kind of job brief, presumably. But interestingly, this guy, what's his name? Amit Chakma, he was formerly at the University of is it Western Ontario? I think it is. But there's a famous YouTube clip of this guy addressing the faculty at the University of Ontario, and all the people stand up and turn their backs on him because he had some pretty dubious dealings and relationships with the staff and the administration there, and they didn't think much of him. And the interesting question about UWA is, did they know and do due diligence on this guy and find out about his slightly checkered academic career? Or did they not do due diligence on this guy and didn't know anything about it? Either way, it's a bad answer, because if they did do due diligence and they still thought, let's hire this guy, he's good at sacking people and getting things and getting things in the way we'd like to see them, then that's a pretty depressing thought about the Senate at UWA and the way that institutions more generally in a place like Australia are currently being organised,
Your
because
judgment, yeah.
not a happy state of affairs, you know. And
Yeah.
at a moment in history when we need youngsters to have some kind of idea about what's going on and maybe some smart ideas about what we might actually do about it, we're shutting down some of the very places and parts of universities that could actually encourage a bit of critical debate, a bit of thoughtful interaction with the policymaking community and all that kind of stuff. So,
Mm.
but it's not going to happen either at the moment. So.
Man, well, like I said, pessimism all the way down. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. Well, I mean, like universities, we got to get out of here, but universities in general took that sort of management private sector turn a while back. And so now, and they all, I don't know how it is in Australia, but in the US, they took out lots of loans and created bonds and all this stuff to pay for nonsensical things and administrative overhead and stuff, but not faculty and not faculty raises. And then there was when COVID hit, it became this almost like an opportunity for them to start imposing a kind of austerity on the university itself, which, mirrors the economy in a way. Yeah.
Except upper echelons of the administrative system, because university administrators are vastly overpaid for what
Mm.
they do, in my view, and our vice chancellor. I think I'm right in saying, I don't know what Scott Morrison, the prime minister, allegedly gets paid, but I think it's about 300,000 or something like that. Might be a bit more. I don't know. Our vice chancellor gets over $1 million a year, and that's pretty standard sort of return
Wow.
for a vice chancellor in Australia. It's not a bad income. You got to wonder. I mean, what motivates people generally, but getting $1 million a year. I mean, there are plenty of things you might be prepared to do for $1 million a year, including sacking all the people who make the university work. But the idea that we're a kind of community of concerned scholars desperately trying to work out the truth of whatever, well, dream on. But anyway, time to.
Wow. All right, Mark, this has been actually super fun, but yeah,
Yeah, we talk
cathartic
about
maybe.
the world and civilizations we know. Yeah, so who knew it would be quite such a bundle of laughs, eh? But there you go.
Yeah, seriously. But the book is called Environmental Anarchy, Security in the 21st Century, Bristol University Press. Highly recommended. Basically, it's it's almost like a philosophy text for international security in an age when the wheels are coming off, when when things are falling apart. So check it
Guys, you're
out.
not depressed by this talk. You're a bit depressed by the book, so get a couple of copies for the family. People you don't like. I mean, Christmas coming.
There we go. Yeah, sounds good. I recommend it for sure. Okay, thanks, Mark. This has been awesome.
Great to talk to you, Van, and thanks for inviting me. Anyway, it's great fun. So I hope I didn't depress you all this too much,
No,
but too much therapeutic
the,
as ever. So thanks very much.
that's right. The Vonnegut form of depression. Thank you. All right.
Cheers.
All right. Take it easy.
Bye bye.